Last time on How EA Lost Its Soul Z, Trip Hawkins had a dream of a video game company, and he assembled a team. Side by side with his friend from college, Bing Gordon, and his marketing wizard, Larry Probst, Hawkins set out to change the world. After barely staying afloat for the first few years, they finally had a hit with Dr. J and Larry Bird go one-on-one. So, where will our heroes go next? Well... Early on, Trip stated, quote, "We imagined that one day, half of all people would play games every month. People of all ages. We saw games as an art form." But in the words of Bing Gordon, who started marketing for the company, but eventually rose to chief creative officer, quote, "We wrote a business plan saying, we're going to get this big in this time frame. But when we got there, it was very different than we thought. The pressure to meet sales expectations was brutal and dangerous to EA's reputation at the time." Bing recalls saying, quote, "I was pushing for, don't ship a shitty game because it's going to ruin our customer credibility forever. But pragmatically, it's, we've got a bad month. I guess we've got to ship a shitty game. And don't worry, nobody will remember. Then you talk to customers and they remember forever." This led EA to start hiring talent to create games from inside the company, instead of their earlier vision of working with third-party teams. This was due in part to EA wanting to assure a certain level of quality. But also, games were becoming bigger than they had earlier envisioned. Instead of one person making a game out of their garage, whole teams now needed to collaborate, and they certainly had no idea how large this would balloon to today, with some game development teams being in the hundreds. Trip was also wrong about consumers caring about the people who made their games. He thought that the names of game developers would be the major brand, but in the end, it was the publisher. It was EA. But they were right about how big the video games industry would become. Bing Gordon recalls, "I remember how we talked about how, someday, there's going to be million-selling games, and someday, Electronic Arts is going to have a million-seller. And then a few years later, I'm in a cab in New York, and I'm carrying a briefcase with the EA Sports logo on it. The cabbie turns to me and goes, 'It's in the game.' I thought, oh, that's what a million feels like." With the introduction of the 16-bit console generation, EA was poised to dominate the Western market. Trip believed the hardware was finally there to help realize his vision of a realistic football game. Similar to one-on-one, Trip wanted to bring in an expert and have them consult with the game. He wanted John Madden. EA's marketing department hated the idea. John Madden Football scored last place on a list of marketability of game names conducted by EA. In fact, it scored even lower than calling the game EA Football. But Trip insisted on having the Super Bowl winning coach, believing that Madden could instantly bring authenticity to the game that might take EA's developers years to learn. And while the game sold fine on PCs, it was a smash hit on consoles. This, combined with Nintendo making $2 billion on the NES alone, meant that EA could no longer view the console industry as a second thought. And next, EA did what I think is the most buck-wild thing in this entire story. Nintendo had a near monopoly on the video game console market in the late 80s, and they could place strict rules on third-party published games. Any third-party publisher had to sign a contract with Nintendo that forced the publisher to pay in full for all of the cartridges produced to the game before any of them were even made. Any third-party publisher had to sign a contract with Nintendo that forced the publisher to pay in full for all of the cartridges produced for the game, and they had to pay it before any of the cartridges were even made, which led publishers to assume all the risk if the game sold poorly. And Nintendo was guaranteed to make money even if the game flopped. On top of this, they had to order at least 10,000 cartridges made, and they could only release 5 games a year. Sega was just about to release their 16-bit console, the Genesis, to the West, and were finally starting to open up to third-party licensing, having only released first-party games for their previous consoles. However, they were planning to adopt a similar licensing system as Nintendo. Trip knew that the Genesis was using the 16-bit 68000 processor, which EA's programmers were intimately familiar with, since it was used on a lot of home computers, meaning it would be easy for EA to simply port their PC games over to the new console. EA sent a team to Japan to purchase a few of the consoles, and then Trip had 2 separate teams reverse engineer it. One to take apart the console and examine the hardware inside, and another to write manuals on how to build their own Sega Genesis and design the tools to do so from scratch. Neither team could speak to each other directly, instead having to speak only through lawyers to make sure they weren't breaking copyright law. This process took an entire year, but in the end, Electronic Arts did the impossible. They had reverse engineered a working Sega Genesis. While this was happening, EA had started to go into production on creating games for the Sega Genesis, and Trip was heavily advised that he should tell Sega that they were reverse engineering their hardware. Trip was very reluctant, partly because he feared the scolding he was going to take, let alone a potential lawsuit. And also, when Nintendo brought the NES to the West, they added a piece of hardware to prevent any third-party cartridges from working on the system. If Trip had told them too soon, they might move quickly to put a similar system in place and prevent EA from doing the same thing. When Trip finally told Sega what EA was planning to do, it was only 45 days before they were planning to start releasing games for the Genesis. And of course the heads of Sega were just as outraged as he expected, and lawsuits were definitely threatened. But Sega really only had two options. Either they could take EA to court, endure a protracted legal battle which they likely wouldn't win since technically what EA had done was legal, and then watch as EA published any game they wanted for the console, and potentially tell other publishers how to reverse engineer the hardware as well. Or they could partner with EA, offer them a favorable licensing deal, and create a strong third-party ally. An ally they were going to need to try and dethrone Nintendo, who had a 98% share of the American market at the time. Of course, they ended up going with the latter, which turned out to be hugely successful for Sega and EA. Electronic Arts was allowed to release as many titles as they wanted, and even approve of them itself. And since they had figured out how to create cartridges which would run on the Genesis, they were allowed to manufacture them. And this is why cartridges from Electronic Arts look completely different from all other games on the Sega Genesis. With two great feathers in his cap, both reverse engineering the Genesis and John Madden Football, Trip had to figure out where to go next. It might seem funny today, but they actually had no desire to make a sequel for Madden. Bing Gordon even said, "We looked at it and we thought, we ought to do it again, but all the market research said, no, you can't sequel sports games. The retailers like Toys R Us said, we won't even buy it from you. All you're going to do is obsolete your old game. They said, what, you're going to make us return this stuff? It's selling fine." But Trip, and one of EA's top developers at the time, were still fans of the Stratomatic sports games, and every year they would release new cards and player stat sheets, and Trip would stay up all night opening his new card packs. Gordon saw this, and decided there really was a market for a sequel. It's sad, but around this time was when EA started losing what defined them in the beginning. Trip dreamed of making developers into rock stars, but this had no impact on consumers. They identified with publishers and strong franchises. They also wanted to work with independent developers and help raise their art, but gone were the days of a single person making a game on their home computer. It was much more reliable to have a studio in-house creating the games. So, EA began to acquire studios. And, since EA had become a publicly owned and traded company, this also meant they were beholden to stock owners and board members. Trip himself says that the reason EA veered from its original path was because, quote, the company became successful. At this moment, though, Trip had to keep thinking forward. He knew that he couldn't catch lightning in a bottle twice. Quote, Sega and Nintendo would have their knives drawn and would be ready to make sure that we never got away with that again. Rumblings were already stirring that Sony was going to get into the console game as well, and Trip figured, quote, if the future was going to be based on Nintendo-type models of closed systems with huge licensing fees, we had to figure out how to be more involved on the platform side. So, Trip decided to step down as CEO of EA and form a smaller business titled the 3DO Company to create a new console that would have a much more open licensing system for third parties. He was also committed to it having the best hardware around, but because the 3DO Company was small, they couldn't afford to manufacture the hardware themselves, and instead offloaded the construction to Panasonic. Trip believed that the best way to entice developers to the platform, and to help break down the harsh licensing norms of the other hardware manufacturers, was to only charge developers a $3 royalty per game, which was way lower than what Nintendo and Sega were offering at the time. However, this ended up being a huge mistake. Console manufacturers normally sell the hardware at a loss, knowing that they will make up for it with the royalties they charge for every game sold on it. But since the royalties were so low and Trip's fledgling company couldn't afford to offset the cost up front, the 3DO was released in the US market at a retail value of $699 in 1993. Trip saw the 3DO company as an extension from EA, who was also the largest shareholder at the time. But when he stepped down as CEO, he promoted Larry Probst in his place. And while Trip had a forward-thinking mind, Larry Probst was more pragmatic. And once it became clear that Sony's PlayStation was going to be infinitely more successful, EA dropped their deal with the 3DO and dropped Trip flat. Quote, "I realized that EA was stabbing us in the back. They were not going to have any exclusive games on 3DO. They were all going to show up on PlayStation. We needed to have some first-party games." Unfortunately, when the 3DO company started making their own first-party games, EA now saw them as a competitor, and Trip was forced to leave the board of the company as well, severing all ties between him and the company he founded. Trip often likes to draw comparisons between himself and one of his heroes, Walt Disney. Quote, "I mean, honestly, for me, it was very much a family business. I had always imagined being like Walt Disney and just founding my company and staying with my company for my entire life. And I didn't really plan to leave." He says nowadays that he regrets the choice to branch out and launch the 3DO, and states that the lowest point in his life was when the 3DO company filed for bankruptcy in 2003. However, Trip Hawkins is still very active today, having created a mobile game company called Digital Chocolate, and serving as a professor of entrepreneurship and leadership at the University of California. And to this day is adamant about the power of video games bringing people together and keeping our brains active. As for his old colleagues, there was still a lot of bad blood. Today, Trip and Bing Gordon aren't on speaking terms. Trip feels that Bing takes more credit than he deserves for EA. Quote, "Bing is really an ingenious opportunist. He can always smell the money. I think he just knew that if he jumped on my back, it would get him somewhere." Bing, who left EA in 2008, was also on Amazon's board of directors for nearly 15 years, was the founding director of Audible, and is currently the director of Zynga, a publisher for mobile games you might actually have on your phone. As for Larry Probst, he didn't step down as CEO until 2007, and was the chairman of the US Olympic Committee until the end of 2018, when he stepped down in light of a huge sexual abuse scandal. When Probst left EA, he handpicked his successor, John Riccitiello, who he had worked with at EA for many years. Quote, "Because he was the founder, I wanted to meet him. I bought him lunch. I was on the receiving end of a monologue for 2.5 hours, I suppose. Without a doubt, he's an incredibly smart man. He's passionate. He lives in what I think most people describe as a reality distortion field. The delta between people that live like that and turn out to be Elon Musk or Steve Jobs, and the ones that don't, it's pretty thin." From the quote, it's pretty clear to see which side Riccitiello thinks Trip fell on. Despite this, Trip Hawkins has a lasting legacy in the video games industry, even if what he stood for seems so at odds with what the current day EA is doing. He wanted to work with independent game developers, provide them with the best tools possible to create the best games, and celebrate their work by promoting the devs themselves. He helped pioneer the box art that we see today, even if it's now overrun by brooding dudes holding guns. He genuinely cared about the product, working with actual professionals like Julius Erving and John Madden to make the best sports games possible. And he reverse-engineered the Genesis, preventing Sega from forcing EA into a bad business deal. And, while unsuccessful, he tried to create his own console to pass this opportunity on to other publishers, which would have created a better marketplace for third-party developers to release games today. This video was a really interesting one to do, particularly because it felt like I didn't know anything about Trip Hawkins before I started doing my research. I honestly can't recall if I had even heard his name before this, but the more I looked into him, the more I came to revere this man. He truly was a prophet for the video games industry, even if he was only right some of the time. Like I said, I think EA was already moving away from Trip's original vision before he had left the company, but I think removing Trip from EA was the day they truly lost their soul. I'd like to think that if he was still involved at EA, we wouldn't see some of the poor choices they've made. Trip himself has been a critic of some of the company's blunders. Quote, "There were all these kinds of buses that they just plain missed. I was looking from a distance going, how did they miss that? It's the suits. They're not the product guys. They don't have the same passion or love for games, intrinsically. Whether or not the suits, as Trip calls them, can be blamed for EA's current path, Trip Hawkins' passion and legacy for the video games industry cannot be denied. And I hope that watching this video has made you, the viewer, a believer in Trip Hawkins' vision as well. Thank you so much for watching. This is the current end of my video series on how EA lost its soul. If there's a great interest for me to continue on and go into EA's acquiring of more studios and talk about the Larry Probst and John Riccitello years as CEOs, I might consider that. Personally, I just found Trip Hawkins a much more interesting figure to base a video series on. But if you enjoyed this video and wanted to see me tackle something specific next, let me know in the comments below, although I do have some ideas for where I'd like to go next. Also, I do a weekly talk show called Around the Monitor, where me and my friends talk through the current week's news in gaming. We record this live on Twitch every Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and the videos from that can be watched on our other channel, Around the Monitor Live, and go up every Friday at 10:30 a.m. If you wanted to be closer in touch with us, please check us out on social media as well. It's super easy to reach us on Twitter, or even easier on our Discord. But I think that's going to do it for now. So thank you again very much for watching and supporting the channel. Until next time, have a wonderful day.